We'll wait another couple of minutes before we start. Is the mic picking that up properly? Yeah, okay, good. Maybe just a good chance if anyone's got questions about the expository exercise now that I could answer. Quick show of hands, how many people have had a look on Moodle to see the instructions for the task? Okay, most of you. So everyone's pretty straight, like pretty clear on what's required. Maybe I'll just reiterate something that I posted to the forum the other day about which questions you choose to answer. So there's 3 questions, and you pick 2 of them to answer. All of the questions, or sorry, 2 out of the 3 questions kind of connect back to some of the readings that were options for the reading response exercise. So it's fine if you answer a question that overlaps with what you wrote about for the reading response exercise, provided that you don't just like copy and paste multiple sentences of text. You can't reuse like the same work for multiple assignments. So a few words or like a sentence here and there is fine, but basically you need to substantially write out a new response if you do answer a question that overlaps with what you did for the reading response exercise. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Okay. I don't want to start until like 5 past. So anyone doing anything fun for Easter? Anyone going away? Let's do a quick, figure out who's going to the best place for Easter. So I need an opening bid. Someone going somewhere for Easter. Bendigo. Can anyone beat Bendigo? Phillip Island. I'm going to score those as a draw. Can anyone beat Phillip Island or Bendigo? Clayton South? Yeah, I reckon Bendigo's still winning. Yeah, Bed's fair. So no one's going anywhere more exciting than Bendigo for Easter holidays? Torquay. Now we're getting somewhere. Do I have a raise on Torquay? All right. Well, so that seems like I'm going to take that as evidence then that everyone's staying close to home so they can really get ahead with the readings, get on top of all their assignments, go and review all the lectures. Fantastic. Great to hear. I hope you do all have a nice break. In case I forget to mention it at the end of the lecture, there's no lectures or tutorials next week, so don't show up because there'll be no one here. Okay. So, moral motivation. This little graphic that I conjured up kind of represents something about the question that we'll be asking today. What are we fundamentally driven by? Are we fundamentally driven by reason? Are we fundamentally driven by passion? Or is it some combination of those things? This is a question that has really interesting implications for ethics. We're going to be addressing this question over the course of 2 weeks. So we're going to come back to this topic again after the mid-semester break. But it's also a question that philosophers and other people in the humanities and the social scientists have been interested in for a whole other set of reasons besides, the primary thing that we're worried about, which is the objectivity of ethics. People in, literary theory and people in other parts of the humanities have, I guess, tried to interrogate this question about what are we fundamentally driven by? Are we creatures of reason or are we creatures of passion? And this also kind of, I don't know if any of you have had this experience where you tell your friends, oh, I'm taking some courses in philosophy, and they say, oh, cool, so what's the meaning of life? And you're like, oh, actually it turns out philosophy isn't really like that. I haven't got any answers yet. Now, as it happens, there is a sort of a small cadre of philosophers who are interested in that question, and these questions about what does it mean fundamentally to be human? Is to be human something fundamentally to do with being a reasonable creature or engaged with one's passions? End up having implications over there as well. So the sort of issues that we're investigating about moral motivation here aren't only of interest to debates about ethical realism, but naturally that's where we're going to primarily be focusing our energy. The first thing today is going to be a quick tour through David Hume's theory of moral motivation. Hume was an extraordinarily influential Scottish philosopher of the 18th century, and his theory of moral motivation continues to structure these debates today. So we'll start out talking about that. Then I'll just spend a few minutes describing this thesis that's called internalism about ethical judgment. And then we combine the Humean theory of motivation with internalism about ethical judgment to construct a different kind of argument against ethical realism. So that'll come third. And then at the end, just very briefly, I'll sketch some arguments for and against the Humean theory, and we'll pick up from that point 2 weeks from now with the second lecture on this topic. Let's start really broad and general. The contrast between reason and desire. Does anyone want to just quickly off the top of your head give me an example of an action or a choice that seems to be primarily motivated by passion or desire rather than reason and rationality? Murder. Perhaps under some circumstances. Maybe some murderers are very cold and calculating, but there are crimes of passion. Sorry, was it you who said it? Who said murder? Oh, I'm sorry, because I was looking at this other guy as if he said murder, and he's like, why are you addressing all of this to me? I'm sorry to both of you. Right, so maybe some acts of violence are motivated by passion rather than reason. Other examples? Eating. Who said that? Why is my hearing like not focusing on the direction of the speech? Yeah, I mean, certainly some eating, some of my eating seem, this idea of eating your emotions. I often say the key with eating your emotions is to only eat one emotion, right? You can eat sad or you can eat happy, but if you eat both of those emotions, you're going to have a bad time. Other actions that are motivated by passion rather than reason. Sex. Who said that? That seems highly plausible. Let's just leave it at that. A good example this morning was eloping, right? Like most times when people blow off their families and go off to Vanuatu to get married, they regret it a few weeks later because then everyone hates them, but the passion in the moment says, let's just go and do it, it's going to be awesome. Okay, give me some contrasting examples. Decisions that seem to be relatively immune to the influence of passion or desire and relatively driven by rationality and reason. Sorry, I missed that one. Yep, I hope so. I think that's a plausible example. Hopefully that's true for most of you. Yep.
Actions governed by the courts.
By the courts, yeah, I think that's a good example. I mean, it's a central part of legal reasoning that decisions can be shown to be reasonable and consistent. Good. An example I like here is financial decisions. Right, think about when you sit down and you calculate a bunch of different financial choices and how they're likely to play out. A formally constrained mathematical process of comparison determines the choice that you make. It seems like passion is really kind of subordinated in that situation, and a really kind of consistent reason-governed process is going to influence what you do. Do you think we can think of reasonableness, acting in accordance with reason, and emotionality, acting in a way that's governed by passion or desire, as character traits? And if we can, are these virtues? Are they vices? Is one of them a virtue and the other one the vice? What do people think? Who would be more flattered to be described as a reasonable person than as an emotional person? It does seem like there's some kind of cultural bias in favour of reasonability here. Equally, though, we do sometimes characterise an over-reliance on rationality and an alienation from one's kind of desiring passion itself as a vice of its own. So think about in popular entertainment, Breaking Bad, probably a lot of people saw this show over the last few years. Initially in the program, Walter, the sort of drug kingpin, is presented as this, brilliant, calculating, clever guy who we're sort of supposed to identify with. Jesse, his offsider, is kind of a blundering nincompoop. But as time goes on, Jesse's capacity to feel empathy and to care about other people kind of redeems him, and Walter's cold, calculating nature leads him into, I don't want to spoil the show. He ends up being a bad guy. Sense and Sensibility. Any fans of 19th century English literature? Right. So this is a great adaptation of Sense and Sensibility from about 20 years ago. This is a really interesting case. So Marianne, the younger sister in Sense and Sensibility, is definitely like the paradigm of an emotional person, and it leads her into some pretty bad places. Eleanor is the counterpart to that. She's the very rational, considered, sensible one, but actually that ends up being portrayed in quite an ambivalent light. That there's good things about that, but also maybe that does alienate her from some of the really important parts of being human. Okay, so what does thinking about the contrast between reason and desire and how that all connects up with motivation have to tell us about ethical realism? 2 weeks ago, we were talking about an argument against ethical realism that was similarly concerned with motivation. What drives human choices? The psychological egoist wanted to say that what drives human choice is self-interest. We're all basically acting in a way that we hope will result in things going well for us and without much concern for other people. Now, as you'll remember, Butler and others wanted to say, this is not yet a convincing theory about human motivation, because even if we grant that ultimately all of our actions are driven by an urge to satisfy our desires, it could yet be the case that some of our desires do express genuine concern and empathy for other people. And so there's a way for altruism and therefore like the possibility of morally good action to still enter into our decisions, even if we are just driven by our own desires. Now that we've emphasized this contrast between reason and desire or passion, a different kind of worry about ethical realism comes into focus, right? So think about the debate between the psychological egoist and people like Butler. The psychological egoist says people are all fundamentally motivated by wanting to satisfy their own selfish desires. Butler says, hey, people might be motivated by wanting to satisfy their desires, but they could have desires that are directed towards other people. And yet, on both sides of this debate, everyone agrees that what's driving things along at the end of the day is desires. Desires for myself, desires for other people, whatever the content of the desires might be, all of my choices, all of my decisions are being governed by desire. So can you see where the worry is going to come from? Suppose it turns out that this is right, that all ethical judgment ultimately stems from desire. Even if some of that desire is altruistic, even if some of that desire is noble, reason now looks like it's gone missing from, the ingredients. And without reason, if all that's driving ethical judgment and decision is desire, now the promise of any kind of objective underpinnings for ethical discourse looks really tenuous, because desire looks like a highly subjective thing, where reason promises us some hope of objective convergence on an understanding of how things really are. Desire seems inherently subjective, something that's going to occur differently within each of us. Right? So like the argument from egoism, this is an argument from ethical realism that focuses in on what motivates us, but it's not concerned with the claim that we're motivated selfishly. It's concerned by the claim that we're motivated by desire instead of reason, and that with reason kind of purged from the realm of moral motivation, now an objective underpinning for ethics is in peril. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about Hume's theory of moral motivation. Hume is the archetype of a person who thinks that it's all about desire. Actually, what makes us tick, what undergirds every single choice, every single action is some kind of desire. Reason, at the end of the day, can only, sort of funnel desire, can only activate desire or give expression to desire, but reason can't drive anything by itself. So this is Michael Smith from the Reader in a part of his article where he's summarising the Humean view. So this is Smith speaking on behalf of Hume. Smith's actually a critic of Hume at the end of the day, but this is a part of the text where he's describing Hume's view. Our beliefs tell us how the world is and how it has to be changed so as to make it the way our desires tell us it is to be. An action is thus the product of these two forces, a desire representing the way the world is to be, and a belief telling us how the world has to be changed so as to make it that way. I'm just going to quickly reiterate something that came up in last week's discussion on non-cognitivism. Remember I was saying beliefs aim to represent the world as it is, and that means they're truth-apt. Does anyone remember, want to hazard a guess at what we mean when we say that something's truth-apt? Good. Something's truth-apt if it's the kind of thing that can be appropriately assessed as true or false. Beliefs aim to represent the world a certain way. We look at the part of the world that they're representing, and if the belief accurately represents it, then we can say it's true, and if it doesn't, we can say it's false. By comparison, desires represent the world as we want it to be. So for that reason, we can't say that desires are false. They're not in the business of representing the world as it is, and therefore when we look at the world and say, hey, the world as it is doesn't match up to the desire, it doesn't follow from that the desire is false, because the desire was never trying to represent the world as it is in the first place. So the picture Hume is giving us is one where those desires, those mental states that represent the world as we would like it to be. They're the driving motivational force for all choices. And what's reason doing? Well, reason is telling us, given that you have this desire, you want the world to be this way. Suppose you want to alleviate all suffering. Reason is telling us, here's the suffering that's in the world at the moment. Here are the mechanisms that would have to be activated in order to remedy that. And so given the desire you have, if you want that desire to be realized, here's what you would have to do. Desire is the driving causal force, and reason is just there to kind of assist or be a tool for mobilizing desire. That's the Humean picture. Now, when we were talking about the contrast between reason and desire just a couple of minutes ago, we were making this very natural contrast, which we do in ordinary discourse all the time, between reason and desire as if they were different kinds of competing psychological forces that are sort of wrestling to try to govern our psyche. And that picture of things where, reason is like an angel on one shoulder and desire is a devil on the other shoulder whispering in your ear telling you what to do, the Humean picture of motivation rejects that. I was just wanting to remind us of the contrast between reason and desire in these characters. So for the Humean, all compulsion to act comes from what we want. Reason can't conflict with that. It can't arbitrate. It can't say, hey, you have this desire, but that desire is a bad one. Reason's not in the business of informing us about the quality of our desires. It's merely a force that guides us when we're trying to figure out how we get what we want. So here's a phrase in the extract from Hume that we gave you this week that really encapsulates this claim in a nutshell. It's put in a particularly provocative way. Hume says, "'Tis not contrary to reason," there's Hume, "'tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." What's Hume saying here, given this theory of like desire is the driving causal force and reason is something that just comes and works as a tool to activate that? How's this statement encapsulating that notion? So does reason have anything at all to say about that desire? No, that's right. If you're a Humean, reason just doesn't care. Reason can't tell us what we should care about, what's a good thing to devote our lives to, what's a good thing to want, right? Reason is just about trying to understand how things are in the world and how it all works, right? So you could have the most absurd, outrageous, upsetting desire in the world, like, so imagine a situation where this is actually happening. Someone's about to launch, nuclear weapons against Russia, which they'll retaliate. And if it happens, a week from now, there'll be a radiation cloud over the whole globe and we'll all die. And you're the only one in the room that could do anything about it. And you're like, see, the thing is, I just got my nails done yesterday. And if I go in now, I'm going to wreck my manicure. So I guess I'll just let that happen. That seems utterly crazy. That's the point. What Hume's trying to tell us is, no matter how crazy that desire is, reason doesn't have anything to say about it because it just occupies a completely different ontological domain, if you like. Okay. Pardon me. Oh yeah, so now I'm going to show you this video.
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow, for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. All right, so I'm going to leave and then I'll come back, okay? So you can either eat it right now or you can wait. Either way, okay? Okay. How'd you do? Did you do good? You did? Yeah. You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. So did I tell you to give you another one? Okay, now you can have both. You need them.
All right. So does anyone want to explain to us what we were just watching there? Who knows about the marshmallow test and kind of why it's interesting and significant? Maybe up the back here, the white T-shirt. Oh, sorry.
Принято считать, что совесть формируется с взрослением.
Okay, sorry. Got to remember not to do that. The marshmallow test. Oh, sorry.
They brought kids into an experiment where they offered them some candy, and they said, if you can wait X amount of time, you will actually get more rewards if you can bring additional candy.
Yeah.
But if you eat it now, then you just get what you currently have.
Yeah.
Right, so we're trying to see whether, at what age children start to develop a sense of looking into the future for further rewards.
Yeah.
How they were able to reason with themselves about current benefits versus potential future benefits.
Good. Right. Actually, so you hit on the thing that I was hoping you would, right at the end. That this experiment, the main reason why this is interesting in developmental psychology is because it reveals that there is this real acceleration point between like maybe about 4 and 6 or something. Like you make 4-year-olds do this test or 3-year-olds and they all just eat the marshmallow straight away. But you get 6-year-olds to do it and most of them can wait. And so some sort of capacity to do with like delayed gratification and executive function seems to really accelerate between those ages. But the natural way to characterize it is something like this, that the kid's able to sustain their, control their impulse to just want to gobble it up and reason through the situation. Right? That's a really natural way to characterize what the kids that won did. Obviously, some of the kids were just like, chucked it straight in their mouth. So we've just been talking about Hume's theory. The Humean doesn't buy this picture at all. For the Humean, it's a mischaracterization to say that the kids who were able to wait subordinated their passions and their desires and instead acted on the basis of reason, right? Because for the Humean, reason never drives anything. So how is someone with this Humean theory of motivation going to characterize what we were seeing there in the kids that were able to wait? Yeah. So what's driving them fundamentally? Yeah, it's desire. It's the very same desire that made like the little girl put it, gobble the the marshmallow straight away, right? The kids who are able to wait were driven by the very same desire. What was reason doing? Reason was just helping those kids kind of calculate through what was the best way for their desire to be satisfied. So because it's the very same desire, eating marshmallows, for all of the kids, that kind of case shows the Humean theory in a really nice light. The Humean wants to say reason, all it's ever doing is helping us reason through, calculate through what's the best way to have our desires satisfied, but what's driving us along is always desire. Now, think about some of those cases from a little bit before where we were talking about the contrast between a person being motivated by reason and a person being motivated by desire. Think about the person who instead, when they get their paycheck, instead of going out to a bar and like buying shots for the whole bar and just being like, says, I'm going to pay down debt and I'm going to put money in a high-interest savings account and I'm going to make all of these financially prudent decisions. In the normal sort of natural way of thinking about what that person's doing, they're not being impulsive and passionate and rather than that, they're being rational and calculating. How's the Humean going to characterize what they're doing? Using reason to fulfill their desires. Great. the human is going to say, no, they're still being driven by the desire to be in a financially good situation. Reason is instructing them as to what's the best way to go about things so as to do the best thing to satisfy that desire. Okay, so this is, once you get into the Humean way of thinking about things, you stop seeing reason as the driving causal force for decisions. Desire is always what's driving it, and reason is helping you act in the service of your desires more effectively. The simplest encapsulation of Hume's view, as I say here, is that all choices stem from desire, emotion, passion, things like that. Reason, processes of logical deduction, calculation, evidential inference, and business like that. This can tell us how the world is, but it does not and cannot tell us what we should want. It can't tell us what our fundamental aim in life should be or anything in the neighbourhood of this. Reason can't tell us that the desire to let the whole world explode rather than damage your nails is a bad desire. Right? That's not what reason does. Okay. So, now we're going to talk about internalism, about ethical judgment. This came up a little bit last week, but it's particularly important in understanding the argument that can be constructed out of the Humean theory of motivation against ethical realism. This is going to be a crucial premise in that argument, so I'm going to unpack it in a little bit of detail. Suppose you form the judgment that you have an ethical obligation to give away some money to charity each month. In the normal course of things, the fact that you've reached that judgment is going to give you a reason to give away money. You have the judgment and someone says, so do you have a reason to give away some money? You say, yeah, I've got an ethical reason to give away that money. And it's also going to confer some motivation on you to give the money. Having reached the judgment, you'll feel some compulsion to go and give that money. But here's a question that meta-ethicists spend a lot of time worrying about. How tight are those connections? Is it just a typical generalization that when you reach a judgment, that gives you a reason and a motivation? Or is it more baked into the very idea of having the judgment that you get the reason and that you get the motivation? Internalists about ethical judgment are the people who think that that connection is really, really tight. The internalist wants to say that the links between judgment, motivation, and reasons are necessary. So, for instance, being motivated to do X is just part and parcel of the very fact of having an ethical judgment that you ought to do X, right? It's not that you have the judgment and then as a causal consequence of that you acquire the motivation. Having the judgment means, in part, being thus motivated. Okay, so that view is called internalism. Does this make sense? Do people get why we call it internalism? Because it's like internal to having the judgment that you get the motivation. I've mentioned two things here that can follow from the judgment. One is motivation and one is having a reason. You can have varieties of internalism that just focus on one or the other. So you could be an internalist about motivation and not reasons. Equally, you could be an internalist about reasons and not motivations. But for our purposes today, we'll just consider the two things sort of together as a package deal. Now, there's a really... Oh, sorry, I wanted to say something about why that's a prima facie plausible position. Here's a reason why it's plausible to think that if you have an ethical judgment that you ought to do X, that means you have a reason to do X. To say that there is an ethical obligation to do X is to say that you have a reason to do X even if you don't particularly want to, right? That's what an ethical reason or an ethical obligation is like. Even if you don't feel like doing it, still it's the case that you ought to do it. So we typically analyze the very notion of obligation or the very notion of like ethical reason such that to make the judgment entails that there is a reason that you get. So it seems really plausible as far as it goes, that this internalist idea that the judgment kind of brings a reason along for the ride, that seems almost baked into the notion of judgment from the outset. And the point about motivation, here's a reason to think that internalism about motivation is plausible. Suppose I tell you that I read some work by vegetarian activists that argue that eating meat is like always wrong, And I said, the arguments are just absolutely persuasive. I firmly believe that it is seriously wrong to eat meat. And I say this to you as I'm like gobbling down my third steak of the day, right? And you say, well, hang on, you're eating meat right now. I say, oh, yeah, well, I mean, I don't actually, it's not that I'm going to stop eating meat. I love eating meat. I just think it's really, really wrong. If at a certain point, no motivational consequences follow from the judgment, you're just going to call bullshit on the judgment. You're going to say, you don't really judge that it's wrong because it's not getting any grip on you whatsoever. Okay, now there's a really, really strong way of putting this. A strong version of this view. Some internalists will say that unless you get a motivation that actually compels you all the way to action, then you haven't made the judgment. So you can see why this is such a strong view. Suppose that I read the article that tells me I should give money to charity. I was, going down to the bank to do a transfer, and then on the way to the bank, I got a call from my kid, and they were like, oh, I've got an excursion tomorrow, and I'm going to need like $50, and I've got my last $50 in my bank account. And I was on the way to the bank, but then I get the call, and it's like, oh, I guess I better leave that money to pay for my kid's excursion. If you've got this really strong version of internalism, the fact that I wasn't motivated all the way to action shows that I never really reached the ethical judgment that I ought to give the money away. And that seems, like a pretty extreme view. So there's a slightly weaker, more modest view, which I think is easier to buy into, which allows for the possibility that the motivation might be overridden. So it says, as long as you get some kind of motivation, even if the motivation is overridden, that's the point of ethical judgment. Ethical judgment mightn't motivate you all the way to action, but it's got to give you some kind of motivation in order to count as a real ethical judgment. So just very briefly, here's the view that internalists reject. Naturally, it's called externalism. Externalists think that the mere fact of having the judgment doesn't necessarily give you any kind of motivation. And that whether you get a motivation from an ethical judgment depends on some independent fact about you, like your preferences, or your values, or your priorities, or something like that. So the externalist would think it's perfectly fine to say, yeah, I think eating meat's super wrong, and to just keep eating it the same that I did before and have no change in my motivational states, right? We're certainly not going to be able to get anywhere near resolving this debate, but I hope with the quick sketch I've given you there, you can see why internalism is sort of an appealing view. There's something a bit weird about this externalistic notion that says you can make an ethical judgment, and it's a completely independent question whether that has any effect on your motivations. Okay, so internalism is an important premise in the argument from the Humean theory of motivation to against ethical realism. So let's work through that argument now. Just a couple of things about the readings from Hume. Those of you who've already had a go at them will know that they're quite difficult. They're written in this esoteric 18th century English language with funny spellings and funny hyphenations. And quite apart from that, the argument is somewhat subtle and difficult. So it's entirely natural that on the first time reading through those passages, you'll find yourself confused. I think the best way to read it is the best way to come to grips with the text is to read it once through, then come to the lectures, go to your tutorials, have some discussions with people about it, and then come back to the text again with a bunch more kind of resources and perspective and work through slowly and try to come to grips with it. As I said at the start of the lecture, Hume's kind of conception of moral motivation has been hugely influential in debates on this stuff for hundreds of years, so it's good to go right back to that primary text. The third reading for this week is an article from Michael Smith, which is going to be relevant for this week and next week. And the Smith article is much easier to understand. It's written in a kind of everyday vernacular expression that I think is quite lucid. So let me start by just giving you the gist of the argument. Here's the gist of the argument from the Humean theory of motivation against ethical realism. The idea is that it's kind of hard to see how ethical judgments are going to be, at the same time, objective facts, things that we can get right or wrong, objective facts out in the world, independently of our perspective, whilst also being the kinds of things that can generate ethical motivations. It seems like you can get one or the other fairly easily, but getting a conception of what ethical judgments are such that they can be both objective and motivating at the same time seems implausible once you've got the Humean theory of motivation on the table. So let me step you through the premises of the argument. Premise 1 is just a recapitulation of internalism about ethical judgment. Being motivated to do X is just a part of what it means to judge that X is ethically obligatory. To reach a certain ethical judgment is to have the motivations that go along with that judgment. Premise 2 is just a recapitulation of the Humean theory of motivation. So roughly it's that motivation fundamentally stems from desire rather than from belief, reason, evidence, and things like that. So here's a provisional conclusion. Given internalism about ethical judgment and given the Humean theory of motivation, it follows that ethical judgments fundamentally stem from desires. Now you can see where the worry is going to enter in, right? If ethical judgments fundamentally stem from desires, well, desires aren't objectively true. They're just not the kinds of things that are in the business of being true or false, right? Because, as I was saying at the start, they don't represent the world as being a certain way. They represent how we would like the world to be, right? Desires aren't truth act. If ethical judgment fundamentally stems from desire, but desires aren't objectively true because they're not even the kind of thing that can be objectively true, it follows that ethical judgments fundamentally stem from something that isn't and cannot be objectively true. And now, ethics lacks objectivity. And the objectivity of ethics is a crucial part of the very idea of ethical realism, that there is some independent of any particular perspective, objective fact about how we should live, or at least how we should act in some circumstances. Okay, so Humean theory of motivation combined with internalism about ethical judgment, bad news for ethical realism. Here's a passage from Smith, which I'll read through, which I think really just encapsulates this beautifully. It's much easier to kind of get the gist of what Hume's on about when you read him through the words of someone like Smith. Actually, Smith was a master's student at Monash about 25 years ago, so, we should all be very proud of his, now that he's like one of these influential people who interprets these figures. Okay, so the problem is that the objectivity and the practicality of moral judgment pull in quite opposite directions from each other. When Smith talks about practicality, he's talking about the ability of judgments to be motivating. The objectivity of moral judgment suggests that there are moral facts and that our moral judgments express our beliefs about what these facts are. But this leaves it entirely mysterious how or why having a moral view is supposed to have links with what we are motivated to do, right? Because remember, if you've got the Humean theory, all motivation stems from desire, and some fact about how the world is doesn't have any motivational purchase on us. And the practicality of moral judgment suggests just the opposite, that our moral judgments express our desires. While this enables us to make good sense of the link between having a moral view and being motivated, it leaves it entirely mysterious what a moral argument is supposed to be an argument about. So you get the idea. If judgments are like desires, if ethical judgments basically stem from desires, then we can tell a really plausible story about how they get a motivational grip on us, but now we lose track of how they could be objective, because it's just about desire, which seems really subjective. On the other hand, if you have a story about ethical judgment where it's grounded in fact, now you have a way to make sense of its being objective, but you lose your grip on how it's going to be motivating for people like us. Right? This is the problem. Now, last week we were talking about noncognitivism. You can see that these two kinds of problems for ethical realism have something in common, that they're sort of in the same neighbourhood as each other. The difference is that, remember last week we kept on talking about the meanings of sentences, the truth aptness of sentences. Noncognitivism is kind of a linguistically oriented way of challenging ethical realism by looking at the meaning of moral language, right? And this worry that if moral language isn't truth apt, then we're going to kind of lose our grip on the objectivity of ethics. Humeanism is not concerned about the meaning of moral language, it's concerned about motivation, right? It's chipping away at ethical realism by raising these worries about that we might only really be motivated by desire, and once you buy that, then because desires don't seem like they're at all objective, you're losing the objectivity of ethics through that avenue. So there's some kind of structural similarities between the two, but different focal points. The meaning of moral language versus our motivational structure. Okay, so should we actually accept the Humean theory of motivation? Is this a correct, plausible view about how we're motivated? Let me give you what I think is the core of the case in favour of Humeanism. It's the idea that beliefs and desires just are different kinds of things. This is just reiterating what I said before. Beliefs represent the world as it is, desires represent the world as one wants it to be, and no representation of how the world is requires you to want or intend the world to be a particular way. Humeans sometimes express this idea by saying you can't derive an ought from an is. No fact about how things are necessarily entails anything about how things ought to be or how it makes sense to want things to be. So suppose I consider a particular set of facts. The facts about how curable disease is rife and lots of people die from, malaria. This doesn't require me to desire that all curable disease should be remedied, right? The fact doesn't have any entailments vis-a-vis desire, right? You just can't build logical bridges from one kind of thing to the other. Facts can entail other facts, but they can't entail desires. By comparison, if it's the case that I want to eliminate suffering, if I have a desire to eliminate suffering, then that desire can kind of have further implications. My desire to eliminate suffering might entail that I should also want to eradicate curable diseases, right? Because if my desire is to eliminate suffering and curable disease is a source of suffering, then having this desire kind of rationally entails that I should have these subordinate desires, right? But there, the entailment relationship is between two kinds of desires. You can build a bridge between one desire and another desire, right? I have a big appetite. I want to eat something. Therefore, I want to eat that particular banana, right? What you can't do is build any kind of logical bridge from a mere fact to a desire, right? They just exist in different domains. So this is the main way that Humeans are going to try to flesh out this notion that fundamentally we can only be motivated by desire. What's got to be driving all of our kind of top-level desires as you keep delving down can only be another desire. You're never going to dig another layer and find just some fact about the world that's motivating. In any case, that's how they understand it. Okay, so let's just try to present a few considerations that might run against this Humean picture. This is going to be a long way from being a decisive counter-argument, but these are the kinds of points that people who reject the Humean view will try to bring against it. So one is to say something like this, that it feels as if in some situations we find ourselves motivated to act in a way where desire just doesn't even enter into it, right? So where a person sees someone in peril and there isn't even really any time for their desire to kind of activate a motivational system. It's not like, oh, I desire to be seen as heroic, therefore I will act, It's just instantaneous. The need to intervene kind of automatically grips a person and is motivating for them, and desire doesn't even enter the picture. Now, of course, the Humean's going to say, no, desire does enter the picture. But the person who rejects Humean is like, well, I'm not convinced, right? I can seemingly understand what made that person act just in virtue of the features of the situation and don't have to attribute any kind of, mental state like the ones that you're interested in order to explain their action. A different line that the anti-Humean might take is to say that there are cases where we are motivated by a desire, but where that desire seems to be engendered in us by apprehension of some facts, right? So we're becoming acquainted with some facts about the world just generates desires that relate to those facts, and there wasn't any independent desire there beforehand that's being motivated, that's being activated. So I think the case where it's easiest to see what the anti-Humean might be thinking of here is cases of like instantaneous empathy, right? You don't have any particular desire to, help animals, but then you see a particular animal suffering and some empathic module in your brain just gets triggered and suddenly you care and you want to do something. And the anti-Humean is going to say there wasn't any desire there beforehand, right? Just acquaintance with the facts on the ground vis-a-vis that particular animal and its suffering just instantaneously engendered a motivation in you to act. And that's this third kind of line the anti-Humean could take. It's the difference between this one and the last one is quite subtle, but there's a kind of ethical theorist, they usually call themselves particularists, who sometimes want to tell a story about ethical motivation where mental states just aren't even involved, right? So it's not that I saw the animal suffering and that caused me to feel empathy and that mental state then motivated me to act, right? There's no mediating mental state between the facts about the world and my compulsion to act. It's just like I'm sort of swept up in the world, right? And I don't have to have this mediating desire or belief. It's a story in which neither desires nor beliefs are involved in like promoting ethical judgment and ethical action. Okay, so as I said, that's just like a really loose sketch of some of the ways that people try to push back against a Humean theory, and we'll say a little bit more about this in a couple of weeks. Just to give you a sense of the general challenge that you've got to meet if you want to reply to this Humean theory of motivation and the argument against anti-realism. The main issue is that we don't want it to turn out that ethical judgment and opinion is ultimately just something subjective. If it bottoms out in something subjective, then that's a fatal problem for ethical realism, right? That means we're going to have to be able to tell a story about where ethical judgment comes from that's got some objectivity in it, where there's some fact of the matter or something very much like a fact of the matter that we could get right or wrong. And then the issue is that this supposedly objective thing is going to be a bit weird, right? It's got to be the kind of thing that's like a fact in the sense that it depends on how things go that are completely independently of our psychologies. It's got to be sort of independently the sort of thing that we can converge upon and apprehend in the same way in order to be objective. But it's also got to be the kind of thing that can get a motivational purchase on beings like us. So it's got to be completely independent of us, but at the same time, it's then got to be able to get a grip on our motivations and compel us to want to act in certain ways. The Humean's going to say, this fact, they'll sometimes say, it's a queer fact. Right? And they mean queer in the old-fashioned sense. It's this odd, peculiar, hard to know what it would even look like fact. Okay. So we'll say more about this after the mid-semester break. Let me just say something about the expository exercise to finish. So, if you need a short extension or a special consideration request, please, don't be shy about contacting your tutor for the short extension or submitting a special consideration application. The special consideration applications, all the information is online. Once you've got your doctor's certificate or whatever it is, you can do it in about 15 minutes. As I said at the start, you've got to pick 2 out of 3 questions, and you're welcome to pick a question that overlaps with what you worked on for the reading response exercise, as long as you don't copy and paste text. You'll see that the top question is about the material we looked at in week 2. The bottom question is about the material that we looked at last week. The middle question covers the readings and the lecture from this week. It also stretches out into the next lecture a little bit, and as you realise, or I should say the next set of readings a little bit, and the lecture that deals with those readings doesn't happen until after the due date for this assignment. So if you want to work on the middle question, you will have to be kind of skipping ahead just a little bit. But I hope that some of you do this. I mean, one way you can view it is to see you've got the mid-semester break ahead of you next week and no classes. If you wanted to kind of get a jump on the next few weeks of readings and read ahead, then you'd be in a perfectly good position to answer this middle question and also kind of taking some of the pressure off for the next few weeks after the mid-semester break. So I understand there's like a mild disincentive to do that middle question, but I also think doing that middle question will help you get a bit of a jump on the next little bit of the course. Okay, so any questions about the expository exercise or about Humeanism before we call it a day? Okay, well, have a great mid-semester break in Bendigo or Torquay, South Clayton, or wherever it may be. Don't show up next week because there won't be anyone in your lectures or tutorials, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks a lot.
Getting to the point, describing your term, like your ideas in the simplest terms you can find. So, I mean, the guide that I'll send you when you email me kind of reiterates that in various ways. But, yeah, I think that's going to be the best protocol.
Thanks so much.
Okay, no worries. So, yeah, send me an email.
Have a good break.
Okay, thanks. You too. Hey.
Hey, I just have a question about the non-cognitivism
Oh, yeah, the Frege each.
Yeah, that one. Is that supposed to be a challenge to or is it a challenge of non-cognitivism, like previous?
Yeah. So it's a challenge to what you have. Right. So it's basically like this. Non-cognitivism says that ethical language isn't language of truth.
Yeah.
It's like it expresses emotions or something like that. And the Frege problem is trying to point out fundamentally is that the way that ethical language works in complex senses, like senses like if Trump did this, that Trump did this, we can only really interpret the meaning of those senses if we treat language as if it's trying to describe that. Right. If we treat language as if it's trying to describe that, then those situations like perfectly make sense. Right.
Yeah.
But if we start treating it like we just express emotions, now it's really hard to determine what goes on. And the problem is, well, yeah, it means that the non-cognitivist has a kind of a big item on their to-do list now. Now, in order to defend their non-cognitivism, it's not just enough to say, when people say X is wrong, they're saying blue X. Now you have to give me a whole big theory of meaning as to how complex sentences that use moral language, like how the meanings of those sentences are to be calculated. So that's supposed to be a problem for non-cognitivism.
Wouldn't it just say that you can't go into argument because it's not like a true pattern, it's just...
Right, but then the problem...
I don't understand how exactly a problem
So the problem then is that it seems like we always do then use arguments.
Okay,
Right?
so we have like a version where like something intrinsically that makes us want to do that.
Yeah, and it's like the non-cognitivists has this whole big practice that we're engaged in all the time, having complex ethical debates where we use these, clauses and if-then and logical inferences. And the non-cognitivist has to say that whole debate is just like not even in contact with reality. We're just talking gobbledygook when we do that. And the cognitivist that's right, your non-cognitivist is going to have to either say, well, they've got a choice, they can either say that the whole practice is just gobbledygook, or if they want to not say that, then they've got to come up with a whole new theory of like meaning moral sense, like complex moral sentences. And neither